94 of them never happened. 94 of the burned cities at the end of the Bronze Age. The fires that turn up as little orange flame symbols in almost every book written about the collapse, scattered down the coastlines. Greece, Crete, Anatolia, Cyprus, the ports of Syria and Lebanon through Canaan, all the way to the edge of Egypt. Dozens of small fires printed on a single page. And when you look at that map, you understand instantly why people call this the moment the world ended. A few years ago, an archaeologist went back and checked them. Not the maps. The original excavation reports, some of them a century old in 5 languages, one site at a time. 153 claimed destructions. 94 did not survive the check. 61% of the fires that ended the ancient world are not there when you go looking for them. Now, some of what happened around 1200 BC is not in dispute, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The most connected civilization that had ever existed came apart. Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, Cyprus, the great trading cities of the Levant. Kingdoms that wrote letters to each other, married each other's daughters, and shipped copper and tin across half a continent to keep each other supplied. Within about 50 years, most of it was finished. Palaces emptied. Greece lost the ability to write and did not get it back for 400 years. Nobody serious argues with any of that. What is in dispute is everything we have been told about how. Because you know the story. Mysterious raiders called the Sea Peoples came out of the water, and behind them a perfect storm of drought and famine and earthquake and migration, the whole system going down like a row of dominoes. It is in the books. It is on the museum placards. I have told a version of it myself on this channel with a straight face. That number has been sitting in the scholarly literature since 2023, and almost nothing you have read or watched about the Bronze Age collapse has caught up with it yet. Nor with the study published 3 weeks ago that finally explained what the weather was actually doing, and why this drought broke a world when 100 other droughts in that same region did not. Nor with 4 small skeletons found under a floor in Ashkelon, which settled a 100-year argument about whether anybody crossed that sea at all. The answer to that one is yes. It is just that what crossed was not an army. And underneath all of it, there is a question I keep circling back to at 2 in the morning, and I still do not have a comfortable answer. Why do we want so badly for it to have been an invasion? Because we do want it. For 170 years we have wanted a fleet on the horizon and a villain with a name, and I want to show you tonight exactly what it cost us to get one. There is a version of this story where something came from outside and did this to us, and there is a version where nothing came at all, and the second one is far harder to live with. The frightening version of the Bronze Age collapse is not the one with the burning cities in it. It is the quiet one. It takes the whole night to get there, and it ends with a man sitting at a desk writing his 60th letter to a king who is never going to answer. One more thing before we start. There are a lot of arguments in this, and I am going to try to be fair to both sides of every one of them. Some of what I am about to describe is settled, and you can take it to the bank. Some of it is a live fight happening right now in academic journals with serious people on both sides, and where that is the case, I will tell you so, and where I have my own doubts, I will say what they are. You can make up your own mind at the end. That is how this should work. Let me start with the fires, because the fires are the spine of the whole thing. Take them away and everything else has to be rebuilt from scratch. Chapter 1. The audit. 94 fires that never burned. The man who counted them is called Jesse Millick. He did his doctorate at Tübingen in Germany, finished in 2017, and his subject was trade at the end of the Bronze Age. That is a fairly dry corner of the field. But working in it, he kept bumping into the same problem. Every book he opened said that this world had been destroyed. Almost every site he looked up was described somewhere as having been burned. And when he tried to check the details to find out exactly how much of a given city had been destroyed and exactly when, the trail kept going soft under his feet. So he decided to build a list. Not a selective one. All of it. Every destruction event that anybody anywhere in the scholarly literature going back roughly a century and a half had attributed to the end of the late Bronze Age. He gave himself a generous window too, which matters. He accepted anything within about 50 years of 1200 BC, from around 1225 to 1175. That is not a narrow gate. That is 2 full generations, 153 events, 148 sites, and then the slow work of going back to the original excavation reports in French and German and Hebrew and Greek and Turkish, some of them 100 years old, and asking a simple question of each one. What is the actual evidence here? The failures sorted themselves into 3 kinds, and they came out surprisingly evenly. The first group were misdated, around 33 of them. These were real destructions, violent and catastrophic for the people who lived through them. They simply happened at the wrong time. Kukunaris, on the island of Paros, was destroyed in the middle of the 12th century, decades after the window closes. Real fire, wrong century, wrong story. Knossos on Crete is in that group as well, and it is the shakiest example in it. Milik puts the destruction of the palace earlier than his window and excludes it, and he is on defensible ground doing that. Arthur Evans, who dug the place, put it around 1400. Most specialists since have brought it down into the 14th century. But that date has been fought over for 120 years, and the strongest case for a later one, argued by Eric Halliger, lands somewhere around 1270 or 1250, which is still outside the window, so the exclusion survives even on the rival dating. It survives on a contested pottery sequence, though, not on anything anybody would call a measurement, and you should hold it more loosely than the rest. The second group, about 35 of them, were what he calls assumed destructions. Nobody ever found convincing evidence at these sites. There was a layer of ash or a collapsed wall, or a floor covered in broken pottery, and an excavator wrote it up as a destruction, because that was the shape of the story everyone was working inside. Ash is not proof of war. Houses burn down, kitchens catch fire, walls fall over on their own after a few centuries of neglect. A collapsed wall in a site abandoned 200 years earlier looks, in the ground, remarkably like a collapsed wall in a site stormed by an army. And the third group is the one I find genuinely unsettling. False citations, 26 of them. These are sites that appear on the maps, in the tables, in the chapter summaries, as destroyed, and when you follow the footnote you get to another book, and that book's footnote takes you to another book, and eventually the chain simply runs out. There was never an excavation report saying it. Somebody suggested it once, perhaps as a possibility, perhaps as a guess, and then it got repeated until repetition turned it into a fact. Milik also went back and looked at one particular famous map from a well-known book on the collapse, which showed 60 destroyed sites. Of those 60, 31 did not hold up, just over half. Now, the number that actually stopped me was not the 61%. It was what happened to the survivors. Of the 59 destruction events that did take place around 1200 BC, 17 were partial. Only a section of the site burned, and the rest of it carried on. Another 19 were single building destructions. One structure, one house, one workshop. On a printed map, a burnt granary and a burnt empire look exactly the same. They are both a little orange flame symbol sitting on a coastline. In the ground, they are not remotely the same event. One of them is a bad Tuesday. The other one is the end of a kingdom. So when you strip it all back, you are left with a couple of dozen serious city-scale destructions spread across roughly 50 years and about 2,000 kilometers of coastline, which, put like that, does not sound like a wall of fire sweeping across the ancient world. It sounds like 50 bad years in a very big region. Milik's own conclusion in his 2023 book is blunt. He argues that warfare, earthquakes and destruction all played a much smaller part in this period than the literature has been claiming for decades, and that the end of the Late Bronze Age was far less dramatic and far more drawn out than almost everyone has said. This is where people take the argument further than the man making it. It is a live scholarly fight, not a settled verdict. Milik is not saying nothing happened, and he is nobody's idea of a debunker. Cities absolutely did fall. Ugarit, the great port on the Syrian coast, really was destroyed and really was never resettled, and you can walk through its ruins today. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece really did burn, and they really were never rebuilt as palaces. Hazor and Lachish in the southern Levant really did go up. Those are not in question. What he is attacking is the scale, and more than that, the habit of citing destructions that nobody ever verified, of drawing maps from footnotes rather than from ground. The obvious place to push back is the window itself. Milik accepts destructions between about 1225 and 1175, and rejects what falls outside, and where you draw that line is a judgment call rather than a measurement. Widen the gate and some of the rejected sites walk back onto the map. The reviews, though, went differently from how I expected. I went looking for a fight and did not find much of one. When the book was reviewed in Antiquity, the reviewer described that 5-decade range as generous, and singled out the reasoning as a corrective the field needed. In the absence of evidence, he wrote, a destruction should not be assumed simply because it fits a ready-made narrative. A German review in Historische Zeitschrift called the book an indispensable starting point for all future research on this transition. So the disagreement is not mainly about Millick's method. It is about how much of the old picture survives it, and that is being worked out site by site right now in journals. But whichever way that fight resolves, something has already changed, and it will not change back. The map of flames is no longer something you can just print and move on from. Anyone who uses it now has to defend it site by site. And that is a completely different kind of history than the one most of us grew up reading. Chapter 2. Inside the Trench. Why a burned city is so hard to prove. Here is why this is so hard. When I first read about the audit, my reaction was, surely you can just tell. A burned city is a burned city. How is this even a question? So let me put you in the trench for a minute. What you are actually looking at, in the side wall of an excavation, is a stack of horizontal bands. Layers of soil and debris, one on top of another, each one representing a slice of time. Somewhere in that stack there is a dark band. It contains charcoal, ash, chunks of burnt mud brick that have been fired hard by heat, and usually a lot of broken pottery. That is a destruction layer. That is the thing everybody argues about. The first question is what burned? A city built of mud brick and timber can burn spectacularly if somebody sets it alight. It can also burn if a lamp falls over in a storeroom full of oil and the wind is in the wrong direction. Kitchens burn, workshops burn, constantly, because workshops contain furnaces. A single burnt building in a 15-acre site tells you almost nothing about the fate of the site. The second question is when. The ash itself carries no date. You date the layer by what is in it and around it, mostly pottery, whose styles change over time in ways specialists can read like handwriting. That gives you a range. Radiocarbon dating of charred grain or timber gives you another range. The ranges are usually decades wide, and in this particular period the pottery sequences are anchored to Egyptian chronology, which has arguments of its own running through it. The third question is the hardest, and it is the one that separates a fire from an attack. Because a fire, by itself, is not violence. To argue for violence you want more. Weapons in the layer, bodies that were never buried, lying where they fell, arrowheads embedded in walls or in doorways, valuables left behind because people fleeing an attack leave the heavy things and people leaving in an orderly way take them. Signs that the site was never reoccupied afterwards. Sites that have all of that are rare. Sites that have a burnt layer and nothing else are extremely common. And there is a further problem, which is one of the oldest problems in archaeology. Excavation destroys the thing it examines. Many of these sites were dug in the 1930s, or the 1950s, or the 1960s, by good archaeologists working to the standards of their day, which did not include the microscopic analysis of sediments or the systematic collection of samples for dating. Their notebooks record what they thought was important. If the excavator concluded in 1953 that a layer represented the arrival of the Sea Peoples, that conclusion is now sometimes the only surviving record of a deposit that has since been shoveled away. You cannot go back and check. The layer is gone. What remains is a paragraph. So when Millick goes into the literature and finds a site listed as destroyed with no supporting evidence, he's not usually catching somebody in a lie. He's catching the accumulated weight of 80 years of reasonable people making reasonable interpretations inside a story that everybody had already agreed on. And this is where I think the real lesson of the audit sits, and it is not about the Bronze Age at all. If you go looking for a particular kind of evidence, in a field where the evidence is ambiguous by nature, you will find it. Not because you are dishonest, because ambiguity resolves in the direction of expectation, every single time, in every discipline, in every century, including this one. The map of flames was not a forgery, it was a mirror. So take most of the fire out of the picture. What is left is harder rather than easier. These kingdoms still ended, Ugarit still emptied, Greece still lost the ability to write for 4 centuries. Something enormous still happened. It just may not have happened the way we were told, or to the people we were told, or by the hands we were told. And that brings me to the raiders, because if you are going to blame anyone for this, there is a name everybody reaches for, and the name is a problem. Chapter 3. The Sea Peoples were invented in Paris. No ancient text has ever called anyone the Sea Peoples. I did not know that until a few years ago, and it genuinely embarrassed me. Not one. Not in Egyptian, not in Akkadian, not in Hittite, not in Ugaritic. The phrase does not exist in the ancient world at all. It was coined in Paris, in 1855. The man who did it was Emmanuel de Rouget, a French Egyptologist who was at that time curator at the Louvre. He was working on a set of photographs. This is worth pausing on, because it is a very 19th century detail. A photographer named John Beasley Green had gone to Egypt and taken pictures of the great mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu on the west bank at Thebes, and de Rouget was reading those reliefs off the photographs at a desk in Paris, rather than off the wall itself. The reliefs show Ramesses winning a battle. They show bound prisoners at the base of the gate, each labelled with the name of his people, and in describing them, de Rouget wrote a phrase in French, Peuple de la mer, peoples of the sea. He was not inventing a theory of civilizational collapse, he was writing a caption. His successor at the Collège de France, Gaston Maspero, took the phrase and built a world around it. In a book published in 1895 with the wonderfully dramatic title The Struggle of the Nations, Maspero laid out the story that most of us still carry in our heads, a great migration of northern peoples, moving by land and sea, smashing through the empires of the eastern Mediterranean, and only being stopped at the gates of Egypt. That is the version that went into the textbooks. That is the version that got the maps. It is 130 years old, and it was written by a brilliant man working with a fraction of the evidence we now have. So what did the Egyptians actually say? They named specific groups: the Peleset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Washesh, the Shurden, the Teresh, the Ekwesh, the Luka. 9 names, appearing across several inscriptions and across roughly a century, not all at once and not always together. In the Great Karnak inscription from the reign of Merneptah, there is a phrase that translates as foreign lands or foreigners of the sea. That one is in the record. It is a real Egyptian description. What none of that gives you is a nation. It is closer to what a future historian would end up with if they found a modern government file referring to arrivals by boat, and decided the arrivals by boat were a coherent people with a homeland, a king and a war aim. And when you look at the individual groups, the tidy picture gets messier still. The Shurden, for instance, show up in Egyptian records as enemies. They also show up decades earlier and decades later as elite bodyguards in the Egyptian army, fighting for the pharaoh at Kadesh. Same name, same distinctive horned helmets in the artwork on both sides of the line. The Luka appear as sea raiders and also as a land people in western Anatolia known to the Hittites. These are not invaders arriving from outside the system. Several of them are inside the system already and have been for generations. There is a further problem with the reliefs themselves, and what follows is how most Egyptologists now read this material, rather than something the stones announce. Egyptian temple decoration is not journalism, it is theology. The pharaoh always wins, the pharaoh is always enormous, the enemy is always chaotic and always crushed, because the entire purpose of the wall is to show order defeating disorder. Scholars have long noted how heavily these battle scenes borrow their poses, their compositions, even their phrasing from earlier reliefs of earlier pharaohs. Reading them as a war correspondence report is a category error. They are closer to a stained glass window than to a photograph. None of which means nothing happened. Something clearly did. Merneptah fought somebody in his 5th year. Ramesses III fought somebody in his 8th. Egyptian records describe a coalition arriving, and Egyptian records describe defeated groups being settled afterwards in Canaan, which is a very odd thing to make up. There were real people, and they really came, and we will come back to them later in a way that I think will surprise you, because in the last few years we have finally got hard physical evidence about who at least some of them were. But the Sea Peoples, capital S, capital P, the unified confederation with a shared plan, and a fleet, and a purpose, sweeping down the coast burning everything in front of them. That creature was assembled in 19th century France out of a caption and a photograph, and once it existed, it became the thing every unexplained ash layer got attributed to. Which is my own reading of how the two problems connect. but it is hard to look at the audit and the coinage side by side and not conclude that the invention created the demand and that the evidence got quietly bent to fill it. Chapter 4. Why everybody says 1200 BC. And it raises a question I had never thought to ask until I read Milik asking it, and now I cannot stop asking it. Why does everybody say 1200 BC? Not 1190, not 1215, not the early 12th century. That specific round number with its strange solid authority. It is on the maps. It is in the chapter headings. It is in the museum labels. Whole scholarly arguments hang on whether a particular burn layer belongs around 1200 or not. Careers have been built on either side of that line. Where did it come from? The honest answer is that it is a convention. It is a convenient marker that got adopted because everybody needed a peg to hang the period on, and then it hardened through a century of repetition into something that behaves exactly like a piece of evidence. Milik published a paper on this in 2022 in a German journal called Ugarit Forschungen, tracing how the date became iconic, and the story is not one of fraud or laziness. It is subtler and much more interesting than that. The interesting part is what a number like that does once it exists. An excavator finds a destruction layer. He can date it, but only loosely, because that is how archaeological dating usually works. Pottery styles give you a range. Radiocarbon gives you a range. He can say, with confidence, somewhere in a band of 5 or 6 decades. Which decade inside that band do you write down? And there is a number sitting in everybody's head. So the loose date drifts toward it. Not dishonestly, just the way a compass needle drifts. Then the next scholar cites that site as a destruction around 1200. Then a third scholar puts it in a table. Then somebody draws a map, and the map gets another flame symbol. Which is exactly how you end up with the audit result I described earlier. A good number of those 153 events were not invented by anyone dishonest. They were magnetized by a date. That does something to the shape of the whole story. If you take a slow, uneven unravelling that ran across 80 or 100 years, and you file every fragment of it under one number, you have manufactured a catastrophe out of a process. The suddenness that every one of us pictures, the sense that the lights went out all at once across a whole world, may partly be an artifact of the label we put on the box. Even the most famous version of the date is openly a choice rather than a discovery. Eric Klein, who has done more than anyone alive to bring this period to a general audience, called his best-selling book 1177 BC, and he picked that year because it is the 8th year of Rameses III, the year of the great battle carved on the temple walls at Medine Habu. He has said perfectly plainly that it is a convenient marker rather than the year civilization actually ended. He wanted a hook, the way I want a hook, the way anyone telling a story wants a hook. And then the hook became the thing people remember. There is an older layer under all this too. The Greeks themselves were doing it. Eratosthenes, the librarian at Alexandria, calculated a date for the fall of Troy in a lost work of around 220 BC, and came out with 1184, or 1183 depending on how you convert it, which is startlingly close to the number we use. It is also a calculation made about 1,000 years after the fact based on a poem, using generations of legendary kings as a measuring stick, and yet that number has been quietly shaping how we file this period for over 2,000 years. So one of the most famous years in human history is, in part, a filing convention that grew teeth. There is a version of this argument that goes too far, and I do not hold it. The date is not arbitrary. Something real is clustering in that half-century. Ugarit ends, Hattusa ends, the Mycenaean palaces end. Egypt fights 2 major coalitions within about 30 years. Nobody is saying the 12th century BC was a normal century. The point is narrower and stranger than that. The precision is manufactured, and the precision is doing an enormous amount of work in how we imagine the event. Take the precision away, and the story stops looking like a bomb going off. It starts looking like something much closer to a slow structural failure, which, if you have ever watched anything large fail slowly, you will know is not a comfort. It is worse, and once you loosen the date, something else comes loose with it. The idea that everyone vanished, because they did not. It is the most consistently misunderstood thing about this entire period, and we will come back to it. But first, this world while it was still standing, not the palaces and the gold, but the sound of it. Because we have that. We have the voice of one man writing about 60 letters, and it is, I think, the most human document to survive from the entire Bronze Age. Chapter 5. Ribhada. 60 letters into silence. The story that gets told, and it has been told often enough that it may have picked up a little polish along the way, is that in 1887, in a stretch of desert in Middle Egypt, a local woman was digging for sebak. Sebak is decayed mud brick, the crumbled remains of ancient buildings, and Egyptian farmers dug it out of old ruins for centuries because it makes excellent fertilizer. She was not looking for anything. She was looking for something to put on a field. What she found were clay tablets, hundreds of them, covered in wedge-shaped writing that nobody in the village could read. They were sold off cheaply, passed from hand to hand, scattered across dealers and collectors. A number of them were damaged in transit. An unknown quantity were probably destroyed outright before anyone understood what they were. And what they were, it turned out, was the Foreign Ministry archive of a pharaoh. About 380 tablets survive from the city of Akhetaten, the capital built by the heretic king Akhenaten. We call them the Amarna letters, after the modern name of the place. Two things about them are worth understanding before we go any further. The first is what language they are in, not Egyptian. Akkadian, a Mesopotamian language, written in cuneiform, and that is not a quirk. Akkadian was native to none of the people using it here. It had become the diplomatic standard across the entire eastern Mediterranean, from Babylon to Anatolia to the Egyptian court, the way French worked among European diplomats in the 18th century. Scribes in Cyprus and Syria and Egypt were all trained in a Mesopotamian tongue so they could talk to each other. That is what an international order looks like from the paperwork end. The second thing is the tone. The letters between the great kings are gloriously petty. An Assyrian king writes to complain that the gold the pharaoh sent him was so inadequate it did not even cover the cost of the messengers who carried it. The king of Babylon refuses to send his daughter to Egypt for a royal marriage until somebody gives him proof that his sister, already married off to the pharaoh years earlier, is actually alive and well, because nobody will let his people see her. And the same Babylonian court writes again, with what reads across 3,000 years as pure exasperation, to say that the Egyptian king has been holding one of its messengers for 6 years. 6 years. These are the masters of the known world, and they are squabbling about gift receipts and holding each other's staff hostage over admin. That is the club. Now look at it from just outside. Buried inside that archive is the correspondence of a single man, and he wrote more letters than anyone else in it, around 60 of them, and by some counts, 68. His name was Ribhada, and he ruled Byblos, an ancient port on the coast of what is now Lebanon. Some translations call him king. The Egyptians would have thought of him as a mayor, and the gap between those two words is most of his problem. Byblos was old even then, and it was loyal. It had been in Egypt's orbit for centuries. Every letter opens the same way, because that was the required form. He falls at the king's feet 7 times and 7 times. Then he reminds the pharaoh how loyal he has been. Then he asks for troops. And as the letters go on, 2 things happen at once, and it is the combination that will stay with you. The situation gets worse, and the requests get smaller. Early on, he wants an army. He wants a garrison, archers, a proper Egyptian force to hold the coast against his rivals and against the pressure coming down on him from the interior. Later, he wants less. He wants grain. He writes that his fields are lying uncultivated, and he reaches for an image to explain it. The land, he says, is like a wife without a husband. Nobody is working it. Nobody is tending it. It is simply sitting there going to waste while he writes. Then it gets worse than that. He writes that families in his city have started selling their sons and daughters abroad to a place called Yarmuta to buy food. That is what he is reporting to the most powerful court on earth. My people are selling their children so they can eat. He writes that he keeps sending word about his distress and that nobody at the palace pays any attention to the messages that keep arriving. He describes himself, in one of the lines, that has haunted people ever since Moran published his translation of the archive in 1992 as a bird in a cage, and toward the end the request has shrunk all the way down. He stops asking for an army, he asks for a ship, one ship so that he can get out. Egypt did not come, the letters stop. What we can reconstruct from the rest of the archive is that Rib Hadda was pushed out of Byblos by his own brother, that he fled south along the coast to Beirut, and that he was very probably handed over to his enemies and killed. I want to flag that the last part is inference rather than a recorded fact. The tablets do not show us his death. They show us his correspondence ending, and then other people writing about him in the past tense. Now hold two things in your head at the same time, because this is the part that changed how I think about the whole period. This is around 1350 BC. That is not the collapse. That is 150 years before the collapse. This is the Late Bronze Age at its absolute height, the Golden Age, the era of the great powers exchanging gold and brides and calling each other brother in their letters. And already, at the edges, a loyal governor of a loyal city is writing 60 letters into silence while his people sell their children to buy grain. From the centre, the system looked magnificent. From Byblos, it looked like nobody was coming. That is the texture the big story loses. We say a civilization collapsed and it comes out sounding architectural. Palaces, trade routes, systems, networks. What it actually is at ground level is a man at a desk writing letters that nobody answers, and getting more modest in his requests each time, until he is asking for a boat. I think about those letters constantly, and not because of what they tell us about 1200 BC. They are the wrong century for that. They tell us something else, something that the flame maps can never show you. They tell us that the machinery was already groaning under load 150 years before anything dramatic happened. And if we take Rib Hadda at his word, which most scholars broadly do while allowing for a governor's talent for exaggeration, then the edges of this system were being left to fend for themselves long before anybody thought the system was in trouble. The great powers were capable of receiving 60 consecutive warnings and filing everyone. The letters do not describe a collapse. They describe the conditions in which one becomes possible. What made this world so strange to modern eyes, and so specifically vulnerable, is that every one of those kingdoms depended on the others for the single most important material in their civilization. Not as a luxury, not for trade goods and prestige items, for the metal their entire age is named after. Nobody in that world could make bronze alone. Nobody. And when you look at how far the ingredients had to travel, the whole thing starts to look less like an empire and more like a very long, very thin wire stretched across a continent. Chapter 6. The longest supply chain ever built. Bronze is roughly 9 parts copper to 1 part tin. Change the ratio and you get something too soft or too brittle to be useful, so the recipe is not really negotiable. Copper is not rare. There is copper in Cyprus, copper in the Sinai, copper in Anatolia, copper in the Wadi Fainan and the Timna Valley in the desert south of the Dead Sea. Any decent-sized kingdom could get copper. Tin is a different story entirely. Tin is geologically rare. There is almost none of it in Egypt, none in Mesopotamia, none in the Levant, none of any consequence in Greece or the Aegean Islands. There are deposits in the Taurus Mountains of southern Anatolia, and they were worked. But the good ore there had largely been stripped out centuries earlier, and what remained was thin pickings. So the whole spectacular world of chariots and palaces and swords and armour was built on a mineral that hardly any of them could dig up at home. So where did it come from? That question has been argued about for more than 2 centuries, and it is the one place in this story where I can tell you something has recently and dramatically changed. Twice, in fact, and the 2 answers point in almost opposite directions. In 2022, a team led by Wayne Powell, a geologist at Brooklyn College, working with the archaeologist Michael Frichetti at Washington University in St. Louis, and a long list of collaborators, published the first comprehensive sourcing study of the tin ingots from the Uluburun shipwreck. Uluburun is the famous one, a merchant ship that went down off the Turkish coast around 1320 BC, carrying what amounts to a catalogue of the Bronze Age: 10 tons of copper, a ton of tin, glass ingots, ebony, ivory, Baltic amber, terebinth resin, ostrich eggshells, and a solid gold scarab with Nefertiti's name on it. It is the single best snapshot we have of what actually moved on those routes. Using lead isotopes, trace elements, and tin isotopes, that team came back with a split answer. About 2/3 of the tin on board matched the Taurus Mountains of southern Anatolia, which is more or less what everyone had assumed. The other third did not. That third matched ore bodies in Central Asia, in what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and above all a mine called Mushiston. Mushiston sits over 3,000 kilometres from the Levantine coast, where the ship is thought to have loaded, which would mean a third of the tin in that cargo had already crossed the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia, hand to hand, through communities of highland herders who had almost certainly never heard of the pharaoh whose scarab was sitting in the same hold. Then, in May 2025, a team from Durham University published in the journal Antiquity, and their answer came from the opposite end of the world. Alan Williams and Benjamin Roberts spent years on a project analysing tin ores and tin artefacts from across Britain and Europe, matching chemical and isotopic fingerprints, and they found that tin ingots recovered from 3 shipwrecks off the coast of Israel, dated to around 1300 BC, including Hishuli Carmel and Kfar Samir, matched the ore bodies of Cornwall and Devon in southwest Britain. The team called it the first concrete evidence that those 2 English counties were major suppliers to the Bronze Age Mediterranean. Cornwall, farmers on the edge of the Atlantic in small communities, digging and washing and crushing and smelting alluvial tin out of stream gravels. Then that tin moving across the Celtic Sea to France, down the river systems, probably the Rhone, to the Mediterranean coast, and east across the whole sea to the Levant, 4,000 kilometres, to a place where the people receiving it almost certainly had no idea such an island existed. Take a second with the scale of that, because it is the single most astonishing logistical fact I know about the ancient world. A bronze sword in the hand of an Egyptian soldier may have contained metal dug out of a stream in Cornwall by a farmer who had never heard of Egypt, passed through a dozen sets of hands, across 2 seas and a continent, arriving as a dull grey ingot with no name and no story attached to it. Now, the 2 studies do not sit comfortably together, and I am not going to pretend they do. There is a published response to the Uluburun paper, and a running exchange between the 2 camps, which is exactly what you want to see. Williams has pointed out that the Uluburun ingots carry unusually high lead levels, which suggests lead was added to the tin somewhere along the route, and complicates any attempt to fingerprint the original ore. Powell's side points out that there are a great many ancient tin workings out east, including dozens recently documented in Kazakhstan, and that the comparative data for those deposits is still thin. Both teams are working with small numbers of samples from a small number of wrecks. Both say so. For what it is worth, I do not think this is an either-or, and the Uluburun result rather supports that. 1 ship, 2/3 Anatolian and 1/3 Central Asian, on a single voyage. A system that hungry for tin would have taken it from wherever it could get it, and it is reasonable to suppose the mix shifted decade by decade depending on who was at war with whom and which road was open. But you do not have to resolve the argument to see what it means. It means the late Bronze Age was running on the longest supply chain the world had ever built, and possibly 2 of them at once in opposite directions, and a supply chain like that has no redundancy. It is not a web with many alternative paths, it is a line. Every link in it is a separate kingdom, a separate port, a separate group of middlemen with their own interests, their own harvests, their own local wars. Any one of them can raise a price, close a road, get overthrown, or simply have a bad year. Nothing about this was hidden from the people living in it either. They understood the dependency perfectly well. It is why the diplomatic letters are so obsessive about gifts and marriages and reassurances. All that flowery brother language between kings was not sentiment, it was supply chain management. You marry your daughter to a man 3 weeks sail away because you need the copper to keep arriving. Which brings us to a question nobody had a good answer to until quite recently. If this world was so dependent on the weather and on each other, and if it had been running that way successfully for 3 or 4 centuries, what actually changed? Something did. And for the last 15 years, the evidence has been quietly accumulating from a direction that has nothing to do with archaeology at all. Chapter 7. 3 rings in a juniper beam. About 70 kilometres west of Ankara in central Turkey, there is an artificial hill. It is 53 metres tall, which makes it one of the largest burial mounds in Anatolia, and it sits at the site of Gordion, the old Phrygian capital. Inside it, sealed under all that earth, is a wooden chamber. It was almost certainly built for a relative of King Midas, possibly his father. The chamber is built out of juniper. Juniper grows slowly. It grows in semi-arid country, And in semi-arid country, a tree's growth is limited almost entirely by one thing: water. In a good year, the ring is wide. In a dry year, the tree all but stops, and the ring is a hairline. And because these particular trees were cut and used as construction timber, and because the mound sealed them away from rot for the better part of 3,000 years, they carry a continuous, year-by-year record of the weather in central Anatolia stretching back centuries before the tomb was built. In February 2023, a team led by Sturt Manning at Cornell published their reading of those rings in the journal Nature. They did not rely on ring width alone, which is what makes this study hard to wave away. They also measured stable isotopes locked into the wood tissue, ratios of carbon that shift depending on how much moisture the tree had available when it laid that ring down. Two independent lines of evidence measuring the same thing by different physics. Both lines said the same thing. There is a general drift toward drier conditions from the later 13th century into the 12th. Underneath that in the record, there are 3 consecutive years that stand out from more than 700 years of data, approximately 1198, 1197 and 1196 BC, give or take about 3 years either way. Those 3 years fall in the driest few percent of the entire series. That is not a bad season. It is 3 consecutive years out at the far edge of the distribution, in a farming system with no irrigation to fall back on, because the Hittite heartland lived on rain. Britta Lorentzen, one of the study's authors, put the human consequence in a way I have not been able to shake. A household could get through 1 year of drought. That is what the storage jars are for, that is what the granaries are for. Hit them with 3 in a row, and there is simply nothing left to eat. And Manning made the point that this is not an abstraction. He compared it to the Ottoman Empire in the early 17th century, which came close to falling apart after 2 consecutive years of severe drought, with far better administration and far better records than anything the Hittites had. 1 year is survivable, 2 is a crisis, 3, across an empire feeding tens of thousands of soldiers, as well as its farmers, and the tax base goes, and when the tax base goes, the government goes. What makes this land is that it lines up with the documents. Archaeologists digging at Hattusa, the Hittite capital, and at Shapinua and other Hittite centres, have found the great grain silos empty. Not burned, not looted. Empty. And the correspondence from the final decades of Hittite power is full of grain. Suppiluliuma II, the last great king of Hatti, writes to his vassal at Ugarit with what amounts to an emergency requisition of food. Another instruction has Ugarit providing a large ship to carry 2,000 measures of grain from inland Syria, up to the Anatolian port of Ura, and the text states, without decoration, that it is a matter of death or life. Meanwhile, the king of Ugarit is writing to the Egyptian court to say that there is severe hunger in his own land, and to ask the pharaoh to send grain and save his people. A superpower, the equal of Egypt, the empire that fought Rameses the Great to a standstill at Kadesh, and then signed the first surviving international peace treaty with him, is spending its diplomacy on where the next shipment of barley is coming from. That is what the end actually sounds like, not war drums, invoices. The tree ring study has limits, and Manning states them himself. What it demonstrates is a severe drought at a moment that matches the historical window for the Hittite collapse. Matching is not causing. Drought does not burn a palace, and it does not on its own empty a capital city. The most you can responsibly say is that this was an enormous shove delivered to a structure that was already carrying more load than it could comfortably hold. But the shove is real, and the timing is uncomfortably good. For a long time, the drought evidence was the weakest part of the whole argument, because it was diffuse. Pollen cores from under the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. Cave formations in Israeli caves, where mineral layers record rainfall. Sediment cores off Cyprus and the Syrian coast. All of them pointing the same general direction, none of them precise, and all of them open to the obvious objection. And the objection is a good one, so it deserves to be stated as strongly as possible. Droughts happen constantly in the Mediterranean. They have happened constantly for the entire history of human settlement in that region. Societies there have been managing drought for thousands of years. That is what the storage systems are for. That is what the trading grain is for. That is what the whole apparatus of state granaries exists to handle. So if drought is normal, and these societies were built to survive drought, why did this one help end a world? That question sat there, unanswered, for about 15 years. It got an answer a few weeks ago. Chapter 8. Why this drought and not the others? On the 24th of July this year, a paper appeared in the journal Science Advances from a team at Stockholm University. The lead author is Catherine Power, a doctoral student in the Department of Physical Geography, working with Chongjiang, a professor of paleoclimate modelling. They did not go looking for more evidence that the drought happened. Everybody already agreed the drought happened. Power went looking for the machinery underneath it. Why that drought, and not the 100 other droughts that region has absorbed without anything falling over? They used a climate model called EC Earth to reconstruct 8,000 years of Mediterranean climate running all the way up to 1950, and then asked what was actually driving the dry periods inside that record. And what they found has two layers, operating on completely different timescales. Underneath everything, there is a slow-drying trend. It runs across thousands of years, and it is driven by subtle shifts in the Earth's orbit, the small wobbles in tilt and precession that change how much sunlight falls where and when. On that timescale, the eastern Mediterranean was drying out as part of a much broader shift, with the monsoon weakening and less moisture arriving from Africa. That process is gradual to the point of invisibility inside a human lifetime. Nobody living through it would perceive it as anything at all. On top of that slow trend, there are shorter cycles, natural swings in the Atlantic Ocean and the atmosphere above it, running over decades and centuries, the same family of oscillations that meteorologists track today. Most of the time, those two layers are out of step with each other. The slow trend is drying while the fast cycle happens to be wet, or the other way round, and they partly cancel out, which is why the region has been perfectly livable for most of its history. But sometimes they line up. And when they line up, they stack. The result is drought far more severe than either process could produce on its own. Not a different kind of drought. The same ordinary processes, arriving at the same time, reinforcing each other. The model finds that the most severe such episodes across the whole 8,000-year record fall between roughly 1400 and 900 BC, which is to say, right across the collapse, and right across the 4 centuries that followed it. Power's own framing of what this means is the part I keep returning to. When we imagine climate destroying a civilization, we picture one enormous, rare catastrophe. A comet, a supervolcano, something with a monster in it. What this shows is that you do not need one. A gradual background change plus perfectly ordinary natural variability, arriving together, is enough to push a society past the point where it can cope. There is nothing exotic in that explanation. That is exactly why it disturbs me. This study has already been overread in a few places online, so here is what it does and does not establish. This is a model reconstruction. It is physics run forward, not a measurement taken from the ground. It aligns well with the physical evidence we have from pollen and cave deposits and tree rings, which is a genuine point in its favour, but it is not the same kind of evidence as a hairline ring in a juniper beam, and more importantly, it explains conditions, not outcomes. It tells you why the eastern Mediterranean was under exceptional water stress for a long stretch of time. It does not tell you why a specific city burned in a specific decade, and Power does not claim that it does. Drought does not sack a palace. Drought does not empty a capital. What it does is make everything else harder to hold together, and it makes every existing weakness in a society more expensive to carry. The team also point out quite deliberately what this implies for the present. The Mediterranean is one of the world's climate change hotspots, and is projected to get hotter and drier over the coming century. Their finding suggests future drought risk there will not depend only on the long-term human-driven warming. It will depend on how that background trend interacts with the natural Atlantic variability that has always been there. Some decades those will cancel, some decades they will stack. I am going to leave that sitting where it is for now, without a verdict, because the question of what this period says about our own is the question this whole video is walking toward, and I want to earn it rather than assert it. But I will say this much. If you had told me a few years ago that the terrifying part of the Bronze Age collapse was going to turn out to be that nothing unusual happened, I would not have believed you. 2 normal processes, overlapping, a food system with no slack in it, and a set of kingdoms that had spent 3 centuries becoming brilliantly, profitably dependent on each other. That is the setup. To see the failure from the inside, we have to go somewhere that almost never makes it into this story, because there is no fire in it and no battle. a village of skilled workers in Egypt on the wrong side of a payroll. Chapter 9. The first strike in recorded history. The village was called Setmat, the place of truth. We know it today as Deir el-Medina, and it sits in a dry fold of hills on the west bank at Thebes, walking distance from the Valley of the Kings. The people who lived there were not peasants. They were the elite: stonecutters, plasterers, draftsmen, sculptors, the men who actually carved and painted the royal tombs, along with their families. They were literate to an unusual degree, which is why we know so much about them. They left behind thousands of ostraca, flakes of limestone and broken pottery used as scrap paper, covered in everything from work rosters to shopping lists to complaints about neighbours to love poetry. They did not farm, they could not. There is no water there and no soil. Everything they ate arrived from outside, delivered by the state in the form of monthly rations: emmer wheat for bread, barley for beer, plus fish, vegetables, oil, salt and extras on festival days. The vizier authorised it, the granaries released it, and it came over the hill on donkeys. The entire village existed on the assumption that the delivery would arrive. In the 29th year of the reign of Rameses III, which is somewhere around 1159 to 1157 BC, depending on which chronology you follow, it did not. We know this because the scribe of the village, a man named Amenacht, wrote it down. Amenacht seems to have functioned as something like a shop steward, as well as a record keeper, and his notes are the reason the world has a copy of what happened next. The rations had been arriving late for a while. That was not new. There is evidence of late deliveries stretching back generations. What was new was that the lateness had become chronic, and the usual patches were not working. Earlier that same year, Amenacht had personally walked over to the mortuary temple of Horemheb and negotiated 46 sacks of emmer out of the temple granary as a stopgap. The men accepted it. It was less than they were owed. They went back to work. Then the payment was late again. And again. On the 10th day of the second month of that year, 18 days past payday, the work crews put down their tools, walked out of the necropolis past the guard posts and marched. They were shouting, and what they were shouting has come down to us. We are hungry. They demonstrated at the mortuary temple of Rameses III himself. Then they moved and staged a sit-in behind the temple of Thutmose III, sat down in a restricted sacred precinct in the shadow of the state's own monuments, and refused to move. Their wives and children came with them. Officials arrived and made promises. Partial deliveries were made, and the men refused to go back anyway, because partial was not the point anymore. It is, as far as anyone can establish, the first labour strike in recorded human history. The main record of it is a papyrus in the Egyptian Museum in Turin, catalogued as number 1880, which is usually just called the Strike Papyrus. That document is not really a story about labour relations, and the inference people draw from it is worth spelling out. This is Egypt. This is the one power that survived. Rameses III is the pharaoh who, in his 8th year, fought the great coalition in the Nile Delta and won, and then covered the walls of Medinet Habu with the victory in enormous carved relief. He is the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom. He beat the invaders, and roughly 20 years after that victory, his government could not reliably deliver bread to a village of a few dozen households 3 miles across the river from the capital of Upper Egypt, whose only job was building his tomb. Not because of an army, not because anyone attacked the grain convoy. The administration simply stopped functioning smoothly enough to move wheat over a hill on schedule, which is systemic failure at close range, on paper, inside a working institution. There is no fire in it. It is a supply that used to be certain becoming uncertain, then unreliable, then absent, while everyone involved keeps going through the motions because nobody has a better idea. And it did not stop there. The strikes recurred. Grain prices climbed, and we can watch them do it, because the Egyptians kept records of what things cost. Under Rameses VII, about 20 years after the strike, the price of grain roughly tripled. Then the tombs started going. Tomb robbery had always existed at some background level, but under Rameses IX and Rameses XI it became serious enough that the state put its own necropolis on trial, and we have the transcripts. Depositions from the accused. A quarryman describing, after a beating, exactly which tombs he opened and what he took. a network of fences running north as far as Memphis, and officials, police, and the necropolis guards themselves either taking part or looking away. The men who built the tombs, or their sons, ended up robbing them. That is what happens when the grain stops arriving. People improvise, and there is a counter-reading of those trials worth holding on to, because it cuts the other way. A state that investigates itself, holds hearings, and writes up the evidence is not a state that has stopped functioning. Some Egyptologists take the tomb robbery papyri as proof of institutional durability, rather than of collapse. Both things look the same on the page. It depends whether you're reading the crime or the paperwork, and then the pharaoh himself. There is an Egyptian document known as the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, and it records a trial, a conspiracy inside the royal harem. A secondary wife called Tyre had plotted to put her son Pentawere on the throne instead of the designated heir. The plot was discovered, the conspirators were tried, dozens were convicted, and several of them, including Pentawere, were compelled to take their own lives. For a very long time, the open question was whether the attempt on the king had actually succeeded, because the papyrus is oddly worded on the point. It refers to remesses in terms normally reserved for a pharaoh who is already dead. In 2012, a team led by Albert Zink, working with Zahi Hawass and the radiologist Sahar Salim, put the mummy of Ramesses III through a CT scanner. They found a wound in the throat, 70 millimeters wide, deep enough to have severed the trachea and the esophagus, almost certainly made by a blade, and almost certainly immediately fatal. The embalmers had hidden it. They packed the wound and slipped an amulet, an eye of Horus inside it for healing, and then wrapped the neck in thick layers of linen so that nothing showed. The same team examined a second mummy, found alongside him, and known simply as Unknown Man E. Skin folds compressed around the neck, an abnormal, ritually improper burial, wrapped in a goat skin, and genetic analysis showing the same paternal lineage as Ramesses III, father and son. The researchers are careful to say that Unknown Man E's cause of death has to remain speculative, and that identifying him as Pentawere is a strong candidate rather than a certainty. That caution is correct, and I will keep it, but the throat is not speculative. The throat is a measurement. So run the century Egypt actually had. It defeats the Great Coalition and carves the victory on a temple wall. It cannot pay its own tomb builders. Its reigning pharaoh is murdered by his own household. Its grain economy inflates. Its necropolis is looted by its own staff. And within roughly 50 years of that victory, Egypt's grip on the Levant is gone. Which was, by the way, the thing the victory was supposed to secure. And here is something almost everyone gets wrong about this period, including me for a long time. We talk about the collapse as if it were an event that happened to a group of civilizations, but the more closely you look at any individual case, the less it looks like an event, and the more it looks like a category of things that were already happening, arriving all at once and refusing to leave. Which raises a question you can, remarkably, now put actual numbers to. Chapter 10, 10 Kingdoms, 2 Fatal Pairs. In 2024, a team published something in the journal Global Environmental Change that I do not think has had anything like the attention it deserves. The lead author is Igor Linkov, a risk and resilience specialist, and among the co-authors is Eric Klein, the archaeologist whose book put this whole period back in the public imagination. They stopped writing history. They built a model. The idea is to treat the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean the way an engineer treats a power grid, or an epidemiologist treats a contact network. The kingdoms become nodes. There were about 10 of them in the model: Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, Cyprus, Assyria, Babylon, Ugarit and their neighbours. The trade relationships and the diplomatic ties become links between the nodes. Royal marriages are links, copper shipments are links, grain agreements are links. And then you do something you can never do to the past itself. You start removing nodes and see what the system does. Their first result is the one I did not expect, and it is worth stating clearly because it cuts against the popular version of this story. The late Bronze Age network held up well. Under their thresholds, removing any single node, any one kingdom, was not enough to bring the system down. Take out Cyprus and the network reroutes. Take out Ugarit and the network reroutes. Take out even a major power on its own, and the rest of the structure absorbs the damage and carries on. All that interconnection everyone talks about as a fatal weakness was, in the ordinary run of things, a strength. That is exactly what it was for. If your harvest fails and your neighbour's does not, connection is how you eat. The vulnerability only appears in combinations. When they stress-tested pairs, out of all the possible two-node failures, they found two specific combinations that would tip the whole thing into a cascade. Both of them involve the Hittite Empire. One is the Hittites failing at the same time as Egypt. The other is the Hittites failing at the same time as Ugarit. Set that against the record. The Hittite Empire ended and never came back. Ugarit was destroyed and never resettled, and Egypt, while it did not fall, went into a long and serious decline in the same window, which is the century I just walked you through with the strike papyrus and the murdered pharaoh, and the empty granaries. The two combinations the model says are lethal are, more or less, the two that occurred. Slow down here, because this is exactly the kind of result that gets oversold, and I would rather you distrust me slightly than believe something too easily. A model is not a discovery. You get out what you put in, and the inputs for 1200 BC are thin and arguable at every step. Which kingdoms count as nodes? How strong is a link? And how do you measure the strength of a relationship attested by 4 surviving letters and some pottery? What threshold defines a node as failed? Every one of those is a judgment call made by modern researchers, and different judgment calls would produce different cascades. If you built the same model with a slightly different set of assumptions, you could probably make almost any pair look critical. So no, this does not prove anything about what happened. What it does is something I think is more useful, and it is a shift in the kind of question people are asking about this period. For 100 years, the debate has been about causes: invaders, earthquakes, drought, revolt, everyone with a favourite and a case to make for it. Klein's great contribution was to point out that this was the wrong argument, and that the answer was probably all of them at once: a perfect storm. But a perfect storm is a description, not a mechanism. It tells you what was in the sky. It does not tell you how a set of pressures turns into a collapse rather than a difficult century, and societies have absorbed difficult centuries before and since. The network model asks a mechanical question instead. Which connections have to fail, and in what order, before this stops being a functioning system at all? And the general behaviour of networks under that kind of stress is the part that reaches forward across 3,000 years and taps you on the shoulder. They do not degrade smoothly. They absorb damage and absorb it, and look completely fine because rerouting is invisible from the inside. And then a few critical links go, and the failures propagate faster than anyone in the system can respond, and the thing that was fine last year is gone. The warning signs and the collapse are not proportional to each other. That is the property. That is the whole property. Which explains something about the documents that has always bothered people. Ugarit was operating normally right up until it was not. The commercial correspondence is routine. The legal texts are routine. The last texts from the city are ordinary administrative business, and then the city is gone. Klein has made this point sharply. A system can look functional while its foundations are being eaten out from underneath it, and the appearance of normality is itself part of the danger, because it is the reason nobody adapts. The Linkoff team's own conclusion is not a pessimistic one, and I think that is worth saying out loud. Their argument is that collapse is not destiny. If you can see the structure of your dependencies, you can act on them. They believe we are not necessarily fated to do what the Bronze Age did. Whether that is optimism or wishful thinking, I honestly cannot tell you, but it is where the people doing this work actually land, and it is worth knowing that. That is the destruction half of the story, and it is where most tellings of it stop. But I have been reading about this for a long time now, and what changed my mind is not any of that. It is what happened next, and it starts with the simplest possible correction to something we all say without thinking. Chapter 11. Nobody vanished. We say civilizations vanished. Every documentary says it, including mine, and it is not true, and the difference between what is true and what we say matters enormously. Populations do not vanish, systems do. Take the Hittites, who are the most dramatic case because the empire really did end, and end completely. Hattusa was abandoned. The dynasty is gone from the record. The cuneiform archives stop. If you want a clean example of an ancient superpower disappearing, that is your example. Except that Hittite culture carries on for close to 500 years after that. South and east of the old heartland, in northern Syria and southern Anatolia, a set of smaller kingdoms emerge that scholars call Neo-Hittite, or Syro-Hittite. Carchemish is the great one, on the Euphrates. There is Melid, and Tabal, and Gurgum, and half a dozen others. They have their own kings. The rulers of Carchemish and Melid trace their line back to the imperial dynasty. The kings of Kumu, on the Euphrates, go further and name themselves after the most famous Hittite emperors, Suppiluliuma Hattusili Muwatalli, which is roughly the equivalent of a minor kingdom in the ruins of the Western Empire deciding its rulers would be called Caesar. They carve monumental reliefs. They write in Luwian hieroglyphs, a script the empire used alongside cuneiform. They build palaces with sculpture around the gateways. They are still doing this in the 9th and 8th centuries BC, 400 years after the empire is supposed to have vanished, until the Assyrians finally absorb them one by one. And when the Hebrew Bible mentions Hittite kings, a good many scholars think that is who it means. Not the vanished empire, but these late Assyrian successors, the ones who are still there to be dealt with. That identification is argued over, and I would not push it too hard. But it is a reasonable reading, and if it is right, then a culture we describe as having disappeared was still being written about by its neighbours half a millennium later. So what actually ended in Anatolia? The imperial administration ended, the palace at Hattusa ended, and the vast tax and tribute and record-keeping apparatus that radiated out of it ended. The elite reorganised at a smaller scale in different places and got on with things. Out in the countryside we can see roughly what that felt like for ordinary people, because there is a site that has been carefully excavated with exactly this question in mind. Çadırhöyük sits about 70 kilometres from the old capital. It is a settlement mound, occupied for thousands of years. What the excavators find across the collapse horizon is not a catastrophe. There is no massacre layer, no abandonment, no burning. People stay on the mound straight through the end of the empire and into the Iron Age, and they go on producing and manufacturing there. They were not untouched. The excavation report is careful about this, and the paper is actually titled When the Giant Falls, which tells you the tone. Life at Çadır clearly got harder. What the team argue is that the residents met those difficulties and adjusted, in their building, in their pottery, in what animals they kept, and came through it. Endurance and adaptation, rather than either survival untouched or wipeout, which lets us say something fairly specific. An imperial centre 70 kilometres away stopped existing, and the effect on this village was a change of circumstances rather than an ending. I find that difficult to hold in my head alongside the other version, and I think it is the single hardest adjustment this whole subject asks of a person, because we have been trained by every catastrophe story we have ever consumed to imagine collapse as something that arrives at your door. Fire, screaming, refugees on a road. For a great many people in the 12th century BC, what actually arrived was nothing. The taxes stopped. The officials stopped coming. The imported goods stopped appearing in the local market. The things you used to be able to buy were no longer available, and eventually you forgot they had existed. Life got smaller and poorer and more local, and it did so over a span of decades, which is slowly enough that most individuals would experience it as ordinary hard times rather than as the end of anything. Now, I do not want to soften this into a story where nothing bad happened, because plenty did, and the contrast is stark depending on where you were standing. Ugarit was destroyed and never resettled. That city is gone, and the people who lived in it either died or scattered and never came back. The Mycenaean palaces burned and were never rebuilt as palaces, and Greece lost literacy so completely that when writing returns 4 centuries later, it is a different script entirely, learned from somebody else. In parts of Greece, the population estimates for the 12th and 11th centuries are brutal, so the outcomes were wildly uneven, and that unevenness is itself the most interesting data we have, which is exactly the argument Eric Klein made in his 2024 sequel, and I think it is the most useful framework anyone has offered for this period. His question is not why did they collapse, it is why did some of them come through and others did not, and what distinguishes the two groups. He walks through the major players one by one and sorts them by outcome. Some collapsed and stayed collapsed. Some took the hit, shrank and adapted into something smaller but continuous. Some barely registered it, and one group, remarkably, came out of it stronger than they went in, which is where the rest of this is going, because it is not what anyone expects. The pattern he finds has very little to do with wealth or with armies. What it turns on is whether a society could cope, adapt, or transform. whether the way it was organised allowed it to become a different sort of thing when the old sort stopped working. The most centralised, most sophisticated, most impressive states did worst. The Mycenaean palace system was a marvel of administration. It recorded everything. How much wool, how many chariot wheels, how many rowers, which offerings to which gods, all of it written in linear B on clay tablets by professional scribes. It was a redistributive economy, meaning goods flowed into the palace and back out again according to central decisions. Kill the palace and you have killed the economy, because the palace was the economy. There is no market to fall back on. There is nothing underneath it. Meanwhile, a scatter of Canaanite port towns along the coast of what is now Lebanon, which had spent the Bronze Age as second-tier players in somebody else's empire, turned out to have exactly the right shape for what came next. But before I get to them, one more document, because there is a piece of writing from about a century after the collapse that captures the New World so precisely and so painfully that I think it is the best single thing to read if you want to feel what changed. It is the report of an Egyptian official who went to buy timber and could not. Chapter 12. 29 Days on a Beach in Lebanon. In 1891, a papyrus was bought in Cairo. It had turned up at a place called El Hibba in Middle Egypt, and it eventually made its way to Moscow, where it sits today in the Pushkin Museum, catalogued as Papyrus Moscow 120. It is incomplete. The end is missing. It describes a voyage made around 1075 BC, and the man who made it was called Wenamun. Wenamun was an official of the Temple of Amun at Karnak, and he was sent north by Herihor, the high priest of Amun, who was by that point the effective ruler of Upper Egypt, whatever the official titles said. His mission was simple, and it was the sort of thing Egypt had done routinely for 1,000 years. Go to Byblos, get cedar, bring it home to build a new ceremonial bark for the god. Byblos, the same city, Rib-Hadda's city, 275 years later. The voyage goes badly from the first port. He sails north and stops at Dor, a port on the coast of what is now Israel, ruled at that time by a prince of the Chika, one of the groups the Egyptians had listed among those defeated at the Delta a century earlier. They are not raiders now. They are the local government, running a port and collecting harbour fees. At Dor, Wenamun is robbed. A member of his own crew makes off with his gold and silver. He goes to the Chika prince and asks him to sort it out, and the prince tells him, in so many words, that the thief was Wenamun's own man, not his, and that he has no obligation here, which is legally reasonable and completely useless. Wenamun continues north, past Tyre and Sidon, and eventually arrives at Byblos. And the ruler of Byblos, a man named Zakabal, will not see him. Every morning for 29 days, Wenamun receives the same message from the palace. Get up and go. Leave my harbour. 29 days of an Egyptian envoy sitting on a beach in Lebanon being told to go home by a Canaanite prince. When he finally gets his audience, it goes worse. Wenamun has no letters of credential because they were taken. What he has is the argument that Egypt is Egypt, that Amun is the great god, and that the cedar has always been given. He appeals to custom. He appeals to precedent. He makes some vague noises about Egyptian authority. Zakabal is not impressed by any of it. He points out that his father and grandfather were paid, properly and in full, for the timber they supplied, and he sends for the account ledgers to prove it. He is not refusing to trade, he is refusing to be commanded. Bring goods, get cedar. That is the deal now. So Wenamun has to send a message all the way back to Egypt, asking for payment to be shipped up to him. A representative of the empire that ran the Levant for 4 centuries has to write home for pocket money before a coastal prince will cut him some trees. Eventually the payment arrives. Gold, silver, linen, ox hides, rope, rolls of papyrus. Zakabal is satisfied and sends his men into the mountains, and the cedar comes down over the season. And then, as it is being loaded, 11 ships appear off the coast flying Chika colours, come to collect Wenamun over the business at Dor. He gets away, but he is blown off course to Cyprus, where a crowd tries to kill him, and he saves himself by throwing himself on the mercy of the local queen. And there the papyrus breaks off. We do not know whether he ever got home. One caveat, and it matters. Most Egyptologists think this is a literary work rather than a filed report. The storytelling is too good, the dialogue too sharp, the ironies too neatly placed. It reads like literature because it probably is literature, but that does not weaken it. It arguably strengthens it. A piece of fiction written for an Egyptian audience only works if that audience recognizes the world it describes. The humiliation only lands if everyone already knows that this is what it is like out there now. Nobody writes a satire about a superpower being ignored unless the ignoring is a fact of life. So put the two documents side by side, and this is the moment I want you to hold on to. Around 1350 BC, the governor of Byblos writes 60 letters to Egypt, begging for help, and gets nothing, and probably dies for it. Around 1075 BC, an envoy from Egypt sits outside Byblos for 29 days, begging for an audience, and is told to go home. Same city, same coastline. The direction of the begging has completely reversed, and nothing in the archaeology of Byblos suggests a great destruction between those two moments. Millick's audit lists Byblos among the sites where the supposed end of Bronze Age destruction does not survive checking. So the likeliest explanation is not that the city fought its way free, it is that Byblos simply outlasted the arrangement that had subordinated it, and when that arrangement ended, it was still standing there with its harbour and its cedar and its shipwrights and its contact book. The empire that ignored Rib Hadda's 60 letters was 3 centuries later, sending its own men to sit on his beach and wait. And what those coastal cities did next is, to me, the most surprising thing in this entire story. But to understand it, you have to understand what happened to metal, because the technology that defines the age we are moving into was not invented by anyone. It was sitting in the bottom of a furnace, and it had been sitting there, being thrown away for thousands of years. Chapter 13. The metal they threw away for 3,000 years. The story we all learned is that humanity discovered a better metal. Bronze gave way to iron because iron was superior, and once people worked out how to make it, the Iron Age began. Almost every part of that is wrong. Start with the furnace. When you smelt copper, you are trying to get a liquid. The whole technology depends on melting the metal completely, so it separates cleanly from the waste rock and can be poured into a mould. Casting is the entire craft. It is how you make a sword, an axe head, a statue, a cauldron. Copper melts at just over 1,000 degrees Celsius, which an ancient furnace with a good set of bellows can reach. Iron melts at 1,538 degrees. Nobody in the Bronze Age could get anywhere near that, and they did not need to, because they were not trying to make iron. But iron-bearing minerals are everywhere in copper ore country. They sit alongside the copper in the same deposits, and smelters had worked out thousands of years ago that if you throw certain iron-rich rocks into the furnace along with the copper ore, you get more copper out at the end. The iron mineral acts as a flux. It helps the waste rock flow away and release the metal you actually want. The problem is what happens down at the bottom of the furnace. Under the right conditions of heat and airflow, some of that iron gets chemically reduced. It does not melt because nothing in there is hot enough to melt it. It forms a spongy, solid, half-metallic lump, tangled up with slag, sitting in the bottom of the furnace where the copper is supposed to be. Metal workers had a name for it in later centuries, a furnace bear, a salamander. It was a nuisance. It clogged the furnace. It trapped copper you were trying to recover. It could not be poured, so by every rule of the only metalworking anyone knew, it was not usable. It came out looking like grey sponge, and they threw it on the slag heap for thousands of years. There is a new piece of evidence for this that I think is lovely, and it was published in the Journal of Archaeological Science in September 2025. Nathaniel Erb Satulo at Cranfield University and his colleague Bobby Klimchuk went back to a site in southern Georgia in the Caucasus called Kavimo Bolnisi. It is a smelting workshop about 3,000 years old, and it was excavated back in the 1950s. The original excavators found piles of hematite, an iron oxide alongside the slag, and concluded they had found an early iron smelting site. The reanalysis says they had it backwards. These people were smelting copper and using the iron oxide as a flux to improve the yield, which is precisely the setting in which somebody eventually looks at the sponge in the bottom of the furnace and thinks, hold on. The researchers themselves are careful about how far this goes, and so am I. Iron is so common in copper ore that its presence in the waste proves nothing on its own. Finding metallic iron in copper slag tells you the furnace got hot enough and the conditions were right. It does not tell you that anybody noticed or cared or experimented. Documenting the moment of invention archaeologically is extremely hard, and this site is a strong clue rather than a smoking gun. But we know where the sponge was. We know it was being made and discarded, and we know that at some point people stopped discarding it. Turning that lump into a usable tool means abandoning everything you know. You cannot pour it. What you have to do instead is heat it and beat it, over and over, hammering the slag out of the mass, folding and welding the metal to itself by force. That is forging, and it is a completely different discipline from casting. Different tools, different furnace, different skills, different apprenticeship, different instincts. A master bronze caster looking at a bloom of iron is looking at a material that makes his expertise irrelevant. And in the earlier centuries, the reward for all that work was not obviously worth it. Early bloomery iron is often not harder than good bronze. It can be softer. The techniques that make iron genuinely superior, deliberately adding carbon to make steel, quenching, tempering, came later and took centuries to spread. So why did it happen? The traditional answer, and the one you will hear in most popular accounts, including some of mine, is the shortage hypothesis. The tin roots broke. Bronze got expensive or unavailable. Smiths who could no longer make bronze went back and looked at the rubbish. Necessity did the rest. And I have repeated that version before, so what follows is a correction of my own work. Among specialists, the shortage hypothesis has lost a lot of ground over the last few decades. It is not dead, and the underlying observation behind it is unarguable. But metallurgists who work on this have pointed out that the geography of early iron production does not simply track where the iron ore is, which is what you would expect if this were purely a supply problem. Where a technology takes root depends on who knows how to do it, who trains whom, what a workshop is set up to handle, and what people are prepared to buy. The knowledge and the social organisation of production matter at least as much as the geology. The current view, roughly, is that iron did not cause the collapse, and iron did not straightforwardly replace bronze because bronze ran out. The spread of iron looks more like a consequence of the whole reorganisation that followed. New trade patterns, new patrons, new workshops, new people making decisions about what to invest in. But keep hold of one thing because it survives all the caveats. Iron's great advantage was never that it was harder. Its advantage was that it was everywhere. Iron ore is one of the most common things in the Earth's crust. It is in the hills behind almost every village in the eastern Mediterranean. Nobody had to import it from 3,000 kilometres away through a chain of strangers, any one of whom could have a bad year. The metal that names the next age of the world is a material that was being thrown away for thousands of years, and its decisive feature is that you do not need anybody's permission to have it. And that pattern, of the new thing being cheap and local and impossible for anyone to control, turns out to run through everything that came out of this gap. Which is where this is going. But first, the migrants. Because we started this by taking the invaders apart, and I owe you the other half of that. Chapter 14. 4 infants under a floor in Ashkelon. For more than a century, one argument about this period ran and ran without resolution, and it ran because there was no way to settle it. When Philistine culture appears on the southern coast of Canaan in the early Iron Age, at the 5 cities of Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath and Gaza, it arrives with a distinct package. Different pottery, made locally but in an Aegean style and shape. Different architecture, with hearths in the middle of rooms in a way that is Aegean rather than Canaanite. Different eating habits, including pig. Different weaving equipment, with cylindrical loom weights of a type used in the Aegean and Cyprus rather than the local kind. Even the way they laid out their cities changed. I should say that archaeologists now argue about how much weight that checklist can carry, since a handful of objects is a thin basis for declaring who somebody was. But the break with what came before is not really disputed. One camp said this proves a migration. People came across the sea bringing their culture with them, exactly as the Egyptian texts suggest when they describe defeated groups being settled in Canaan. The other camp said no. Pottery is not people. Fashions travel. Traders travel. A collapsing empire withdraws and local elites reinvent themselves using prestigious foreign styles, and you get a culture change with no significant movement of population at all. We have modern examples of that happening all the time. Both arguments were reasonable. Neither could be tested. The debate simply had nowhere to go. Then, in July 2019, a team from the Max Planck Institute in Germany, working with the Leon Levy expedition to Ashkelon, published in Science Advances. Ashkelon is a large site on the coast of modern Israel, and it has been excavated for decades. Over that time, the archaeologists uncovered burials from several different periods, which is exactly what you need. Not one moment, but a sequence. The genetics team, led by Michael Feldman with Daniel Master and Johannes Krause, sampled 108 skeletal elements, teeth and the dense inner ear bone, which are the best preservers of ancient DNA. 10 of them yielded enough usable genetic material. They then analysed over 1 million points across each genome, 10 individuals from 3 periods. 3 of them are from the late Bronze Age, before Philistine culture appears. Genetically, they are not distinguishable from the local Levantine population, ordinary Canaanites, in an ordinary Canaanite city. Then there are 4 individuals from the early Iron Age, exactly the moment the pottery changes, the architecture changes, and the culture we call Philistine shows up. They are infants, buried, as infants were in that community, beneath the earthen floors of the houses, and they carry between 25% and 70% of their ancestry from populations of southern Europe. The closest matches available run to the Aegean, to Sardinia, to Iberia. The team's estimate for when that gene flow arrived falls in a window that spans the collapse itself. So people really did cross that sea. Whatever else was going on with the pottery, this is families. People arriving somewhere new at exactly the moment the old order was coming apart, and burying their children under their own floors in the new place. Because that is what you do with your dead when they are that small and you want them near you. And then, within about 2 centuries, the signal disappears. The later Iron Age burials at Ashkelon are genetically local again. The European component is no longer detectable at all. The reading the team offer, and it is hard to see what else would do it, is straightforward intermarriage. The incomers married locals, generation after generation, until the signal was diluted below the point where the analysis can find it. While the culture stayed distinct. Their neighbours went on calling them Philistines for centuries. They kept their own material culture, their own institutions, their own identity, long after they had genetically merged into the surrounding population entirely. That combination is one of the very few things in all of this that I find straightforwardly beautiful. A migration happened. It was real, it was people, and it left physical traces in the bones of children. And within roughly 6 or 7 generations, the migrants and the locals had married into each other so completely that you cannot tell them apart in the genome. And yet the culture, the name, the sense of who they were, carried on for another 500 years. Culture and ancestry came apart almost immediately. Feldman herself made that point when the study came out. What people are and what they are descended from are not the same thing. The limits here are real. 10 individuals is a very small sample. 4 infants is a very small sample. This is 1 city out of 5, and it does not tell you about Ekron or Gath or Gaza or Ashdod, and it certainly does not tell you about the other groups named in the Egyptian inscriptions. It confirms one migration into one place. It does not validate the whole 19th century picture of a Sea People's Confederation sweeping the coast, and it fits that picture badly anyway. An invasion is soldiers. What the ground actually shows at Ashkelon is infants under floors, and a population that intermarried so fast it vanished into its neighbours in 200 years. That is not an invasion. That is a migration that became neighbours, which is, when you think about it, what happens at the end of almost every collapse anyone has ever studied. People move. They move because staying is worse. They arrive somewhere, and if the place they arrive in has room, within a few generations everybody is related to everybody, and the only thing left of the distinction is a name and an argument about whose grandmother came from where. All of which leaves a ledger, and the ledger is where this finally resolves into something you can hold. Chapter 15. The Ledger. What the Dark Age actually bought. We call the 4 centuries that follow a Dark Age, and for the palaces it absolutely was. If you were a Mycenaean scribe or a Hittite tax official, or a court musician at Pylos, your world ended and nothing replaced it in your lifetime or your grandchildren's. But a dark age is only dark from the point of view of the people who lost. The list of who won is longer and stranger than anyone expects, and it is worth going through slowly. Start with writing, since that is the loss everyone mentions. The palace scripts died. Linear B, the script the Mycenaean administration used, vanishes completely when the palaces burn, because Linear B existed for one purpose: keeping palace accounts. It was a professional tool used by a small guild of specialists to record how much barley went where. Nobody wrote poetry in it. Nobody wrote letters home in it. When the institution that needed it stopped existing, the skill had no other reason to survive, and it did not. Greece is functionally illiterate for 400 years. What comes back is not the same thing at all. Along the Levantine coast, the alphabet takes its mature form, 22 signs, each one standing for a consonant sound. That is the whole system. You can learn it in a few days. Compare that to what it replaced. Egyptian hieroglyphs run to hundreds of signs and required years of training. Cuneiform is worse. A competent Akkadian scribe had to command several hundred signs, many of which could be read as a whole word or as a syllable, or as a silent classifier depending on context, and had to do it in a language that was not his own. That is not a skill you pick up, that is a career, entered in childhood, in a school, under a master. Which means literacy in the Bronze Age was not a general human capability. It was a licensed profession, and the license was issued by the palace. 22 signs breaks the license. A merchant can learn it. A merchant's son can learn it. A shipwright can scratch his name on a jar. And crucially, nobody owns it. There is no institution issuing it, no school controlling entry, no palace deciding who gets trained. It moves along trade routes because it is useful, and it gets adopted and adapted by whoever picks it up, which is how we end up with Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic and eventually Latin, and eventually the letters I am reading these words from. That could never have happened while the palaces stood. The palaces owned writing, not metaphorically, literally institutionally as a monopoly. There is no plausible version of the Late Bronze Age where the great administrative powers of the age look at a cheap portable script that anyone can learn and say, yes, wonderful, let us hand that to the merchants. Their entire administrative advantage depended on the difficulty. The technology that replaced them could only spread because they were gone. And the same shape shows up everywhere you look at this period. Take the cities that carried the alphabet outward: Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Arwad, Beirut. During the Bronze Age, these were second-tier players, Canaanite ports in somebody else's system, taking orders from Egypt or from Hatti depending on the decade. Byblos, again, is the one to watch, because we have already followed it twice. A governor writing 60 unanswered letters, and then an Egyptian envoy being told to go home. With the land empires gone, those ports stop being anyone's vassals, and within a couple of centuries they are the dominant traders of the eastern Mediterranean. Within a few more they have planted settlements along North Africa and Sicily and Sardinia and the coast of Spain. Carthage is one of theirs. They sail to Gades, modern Cadiz, out past the strait and into the Atlantic. What they were reaching for out there is not spelled out anywhere, but it is not hard to guess. The Durham team's analysis picked up Cornish tin in a wreck off the French coast dating to around 600 BC, which is to say the northern tin was still moving south long after the Bronze Age ended. So a fair assumption is that the Phoenicians went west for the metal, and that the difference from before was who held the route. They were not buying it from middlemen anymore, they were the middlemen. They also developed the purple dye that becomes the most expensive commodity in the ancient world. They carry the alphabet everywhere they go, which is why the Greeks got it from them and called their letters Phoinikeia, Grammata, Phoenician things. The word that gets reached for here comes out of modern risk theory rather than archaeology: anti-fragile. Not merely resilient, meaning able to take a hit and recover, but positively better off for the disorder, and it fits. The chaos that ruined the great powers cleared the sea lanes of anyone with the authority to say no. Greece is the case that ought to make everyone pause, because Greece is where the ledger looks worst before it looks best. Greece took this worse than almost anybody. The palaces burn, literacy goes, the population falls, long-distance trade largely stops, building in stone stops. By any measure you want to apply, the Greek 12th and 11th centuries are a catastrophe with almost nothing to recommend them. And what grows back out of that is the Greek city-state. Nothing like a palace. Something smaller and poorer and far more local, organised on completely different lines, with citizens and assemblies and public spaces, and an idea that arrives eventually and changes everything. That the community rather than the king is the thing that decides. Within 5 centuries of the bottom, that arrangement produces Athens. I am not going to draw a straight causal line from the collapse to the Parthenon, because that would be silly and no serious historian would let me get away with it. 400 years is a very long time and 100 other things happened. But the political form that emerged in Greece was only possible on ground that had been cleared. There was no surviving palace system to prevent it, because the palace system had burned and nobody rebuilt it. The same period in the southern Levant produces something else you may find familiar. As Egyptian control recedes from Canaan through the 12th and 11th centuries, a set of small kingdoms takes shape in the hill country, and along the coast and across the Jordan: Israel and Judah, Philistia, Edom, Moab, Ammon. Small, poor, fractious, and mostly ignored by anyone powerful for a couple of centuries. The texts that eventually come out of that world are read today by something like half the world. None of that could have happened while Egypt was still garrisoning the Levant, for the same reason the alphabet could not have escaped the scribal schools while the schools were running. The space had to be empty first, so run the ledger honestly, both columns, no thumb on the scale. In the lost column, the most connected civilization the world had yet produced was destroyed. Real cities really did burn, and some of them never came back. Ugarit is still an empty field. Whole languages died. Greece lost the ability to write for 400 years, and it took something like 4 centuries before the Eastern Mediterranean was as prosperous and as interconnected as it had been in 1250 BC. That is not a small bill. That is roughly the span from the reign of Elizabeth I to today, spent going backwards and then slowly climbing out. In the other column, iron, the alphabet, the Phoenician sea trade and the settlement of the Western Mediterranean, the Greek city-state, the kingdoms and the books of the Iron Age Levant, the end of the palace monopoly on metal, on writing, on ships, and on grain. And the argument I would make, which is an argument rather than a fact, is that not one of those was available while the palaces stood, because in each case the palaces owned the alternative. They owned the metal, the writing, the ships, and the grain, and a monopoly does not license its own replacement. And I keep coming back to that, because it is the most uncomfortable idea in this whole subject, and I have not found a way around it. The collapse did not end the world. It broke a monopoly. Chapter 16. The hole in the middle of it. Before I hand this over to you, there is a hole in the middle of all this, and you should know how big it is. Because I have spent most of tonight telling you what has been taken apart, and it would be dishonest to leave you with the impression that anybody has put something tidy in its place. These are the gaps, and my best guess at where the next answers come from. We do not know who the raiders were. We have one city, Ashkelon, with genetic evidence for one migration from somewhere in the southern European world. That is a real answer to a real question, and it is the strongest single piece of evidence anyone has produced in a century. It is also 10 skeletons. Whether the Sherden came from Sardinia, whether the Denian have anything to do with the Danaans of Homer, whether the Shekelesh went to Sicily or came from it, whether any of these groups had anything to do with each other at all of that is still guesswork with better vocabulary. Ancient DNA work is expanding fast, and the coastal cities of Israel, Cyprus, southern Anatolia, and the Aegean are all being sampled. In 10 years we will know things about who moved where that are simply unavailable today. We do not have secure dates for most of the destructions that are real. That is a much bigger problem than it sounds. Almost all the dating in this period is relative, built on pottery sequences that are themselves anchored to Egyptian chronology, which has its own arguments. Radiocarbon dating with modern statistical methods can now sometimes narrow a destruction to within a few decades, but it has been applied to only a fraction of the relevant layers, and where it has been applied it has occasionally produced results that annoy everybody. Every time somebody redates a major site properly, the sequence shifts. There will be more of that. We do not agree about earthquakes. There is a long-standing idea that a cluster of major quakes ran along the fault systems of the Eastern Mediterranean in this period, and it has been used to explain a lot of collapsed walls. Milik is sceptical of most of the individual cases, on the same grounds as the fires. A fallen wall is not a diagnosis. Seismologists and archaeologists are still working out what actually counts as evidence of a quake in a ruined building, and that argument has years left in it. We know almost nothing about disease, and I suspect that is a gap that will get filled. We now have the tools to look for pathogen DNA in ancient remains, and it has already rewritten the history of plague in other periods. Nobody has yet found the smoking gun for the late Bronze Age. That does not mean there is nothing there. It means nobody has looked hard enough yet in enough places, and we do not know in any satisfying way why some places came through and others did not. Clean sorting of the winners and losers is the best framework we have, and it is descriptive rather than predictive. It tells you what happened to each society. It does not tell you what property specifically made Cyprus able to reorganize while Ugarit could not, when they were a day's sail apart and doing much the same business. The honest position, in August of this year, is that there was no single catastrophe. A climate squeeze lasting generations understood far better this month than last, pressing down on societies that had spent 3 centuries making themselves dependent on each other and keeping no reserves. Real destructions, fewer than we have been saying and spread thin across decades. People moving, driven by the same conditions that were breaking the states they moved through, and in the one great power that came through it, a slow administrative failure that shows up in unpaid workers and stolen grave goods rather than in ash. Contested at the edges, every bit of it. At the centre, not really. And the thing I cannot get around, the thing that has changed how I read the news, is that the shape of this has almost nothing in common with how we tell disaster stories. There is no villain. That is what the audit really took away from us, not the fires. The villain. We have wanted the Sea Peoples for 170 years because they are a shape our minds are comfortable with. Something came from outside and did this to us. That is a story with an enemy, an event, a date, and a moral. It is much easier to hold than the alternative, which is that a brilliant, wealthy, sophisticated, deeply intelligent civilization was assembled in a way that could not survive a few bad decades, and that most of the damage was done by weather, distance, and arithmetic. Chapter 17. Could it happen to us? Which brings us finally to the question I opened with and have been carrying all night. Could it happen to us? I said at the beginning that I would not pretend to answer that for you, and I meant it. But I can lay out the 2 ways of hearing everything I have just told you, as fairly as I know how, and then I genuinely want to know which one you hear, because I go back and forth, and I have been going back and forth for years. The first reading is that this is a warning, and a specific one. Their world was fragile in exactly the places where it was strongest. Long supply lines that crossed continents for a material nobody could substitute. Specialist knowledge held by a small number of trained people in a small number of institutions. A food system with no slack in it, where 1 bad year was survivable and 3 were not. Highly centralized administration, so that when the centre stopped functioning there was nothing underneath to catch anything, and a climate shifting slowly beneath all of it on a timescale too long for anyone alive to notice. Read that list again and tell me which item does not describe us. We have longer supply chains for more materials with fewer sources. There are minerals in the device you're watching this on that come from 2 or 3 countries on Earth, and if those countries have a bad decade, so do we. Our specialist knowledge is more concentrated, not less. Our food system moves faster and stores less, because storing things is expensive and we optimize the storage out. And the modelling work says a connected system does not warn you proportionally. The rerouting that keeps it standing is the same thing that hides how much of it has already gone. Ugarit's paperwork was routine until the week it ended. That is the frightening reading, and I do not think it is a silly one. Serious people who study risk for a living, including the team who built that network model, look at this period and see a rehearsal. But there is a second reading, and it is not a consolation prize. It is a different conclusion from the same evidence. Nobody died out. The palaces fell and the people stayed. They got poorer, smaller, and more local. They lost things they never got back, and some of them lost everything. And within a few centuries they had built something that was, by almost any measure that matters, better than what they lost. Iron that anybody could have. Writing that anybody could learn. Ships that answered to nobody. Cities that governed themselves. A world in which the ability to read and the ability to make a tool were no longer gifts handed down from a palace. Not one person living through the bad years could have seen that coming. If you had stood in the ruins of Pylos in 1150 BC and told somebody that this was the beginning of something, they would have been entitled to hit you. And that reading says something quite specific about collapse. It says that the thing which fails in these events is a particular arrangement of power, and nothing more fundamental than that. Not the people, not the knowledge, not the ability to build. The arrangement goes, something else grows in the space it leaves, and the something else is often whatever the arrangement had been sitting on top of. Both readings come from exactly the same evidence. I have not hidden anything from you to make either one work. I lean toward the first one on some days and the second one on others, and I have stopped being embarrassed about that, because on a 3,000-year-old question that people are still fighting over, Holding both and continuing to read is the only place you can defensively stand. What I keep, out of all of it, is small and physical. 3 hairline rings in a juniper beam under a Turkish burial mound. A man in Byblos writing his 60th letter, asking now for a boat rather than an army. Tomb builders walking off the job in the heat and shouting that they were hungry. And 4 infants under a floor in Ashkelon with the Aegean still in their bones. Now you tell me which reading you hear, and why. A warning about how fragile a connected world really is, or proof of how much better people can build once the old arrangement finally gets out of the way. Down in the comments, and be specific. The good ones change how I write the next one. If you know something I got wrong, I especially want that. This subject is moving fast enough that I fully expect to be correcting parts of tonight within a couple of years. If this earned the time you gave it, the like button and the subscribe button are honestly the only way I find out whether any of this is landing. They are small, and they are the entire reason I get to keep doing this. And if what got you here was the question of how a world this connected could come apart at all, watch the one I made on the Odyssey next, because that is the story of the 400 years of silence afterwards, and how a poem written on the other side of it turned out to remember things nobody thought could have survived the gap. Civilizations rarely go out screaming. Mostly they stop answering their letters, let the granary run down, and quietly forget how to do the thing they were famous for. Keep your minds open, and until we meet again.